What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Wednesday, August 21st edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have an 8-game main slate tonight. Looks like a pretty interesting one. Again, just a lot of teams that have pretty modest implied run totals, some decent pitching on the slate. Not a lot offensively that really stands out. There are a couple spots that are likely to pull the bulk of the ownership. Kansas City and the Yankees, both with implied run totals north of 5. A few other teams in the mid 4s. A lot of teams actually below 4 or right around 4. So another tournament slate that I think is pretty wide open. I think there's a lot of ways that you can approach it. I did take a little bit different approach in the lineups that I put together for today's show than I have on some other shows recently. There are, I think, a couple of different ways you can approach DFS tournaments in general that are both perfectly fine. It's something we talk about a lot at Endgame Syndicate, whether you are playing more balanced or looking to exploit the field more. Typically, I play a little bit more balanced, and that's why on these shows, you'll see that my player exposures for a lot of teams are very, very similar to the field, with a couple of exceptions where I'm a little high or a little low. But you can also take an approach where you are more aggressively seeking out where you think the field isn't likely to, or where you think the field is likely to be making mistakes, and attack those a little bit more aggressively. That's another approach you can take. Like I said, we talk about that a lot, the two different strategies at Endgame. We have videos out on it and all of that. But I took a little bit more exploitive approach to this one. So you are going to see bigger stands for me on this show than on some previous shows. Again, I think that there are pros and cons of both strategies, but I wanted to talk about this one. I do think it makes, in general, for a little bit more interesting show anyway. But I think that, there are pros and cons in your larger field tournaments, maybe a little bit stronger argument actually for taking this approach, taking some bigger stands than I normally do. It does come with bigger swings, obviously. The further away you are from the field, the bigger stands you're taking, the more you're opening yourself up to big losing days as opposed to your typical just losing like 50% in any given tournament. So that is one of the trade-offs. But I did take that approach for this slate. Obviously, if it's something that you're interested in, you want to hear more about strategy and all of that, sign up for Endgame using the link in the description below. Also have links in there for my Dub Club content that is included at Endgame. It's my MLB projections, ownership, top stack percentages, optimal percentages, all of that. That is included for Endgame members as well. And also, if you're drafting best ball, the link is in there for Brick 75's Draft Caddy. You can find all of that in the description below. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, all that stuff. Now getting into it, starting with the pitching as usual. This is my first look at these lineups, so interested to see how it looks. I do just know that I have some pretty big stands in general. But starting with Ryan Pepiot here, showing up in 76% of the lineups that I built. He has a good strikeout matchup against Oakland. He's in a good pitcher's park. He's a good pitcher. He returned from the injured list his last time out, threw around 80 pitches. For the season, has a 26.5% K percentage. That is the second highest on the slate behind Jack Flaherty. 3.92 xFIP is solid. He also grades out well for me in some of my pitch type stuff. Gave him a little bit of a bump for that. So I am pretty aggressively getting the Pepiot here. $85 or $8,300 price tag looks pretty good. Obviously, a good strikeout matchup against Oakland as well. Their active roster has one of the highest strikeout percentages against right-handed pitching. They rank 4th. They do have a 103 WRC plus as well. But they're an offense that can do damage if Pepiot is not on top of his game. But if he is, he should be able to rack up strikeouts here in a good strikeout matchup. So happy to get to him. Field's at about 26%. I'm obviously over that. For maybe the first time all season, I'm getting to more Max Fried than the field. He's a pitcher that I usually don't get a lot of because he's not a great strikeout pitcher. He is very good at limiting production, getting weak contact, working relatively deep into games, but only has a 22.5% strikeout percentage. He's only $8,500 on today's slate, though. He has been higher than that at times this year when he's been popular, and I'm not getting there. It's not the best matchup with Philadelphia, but he is getting 20% ownership. I'm about 2x the field on him. 22.5% K percentage, 3.47 xFIP this year. So again, I've talked about it on a lot of shows. Ideally, I don't like going to popular pitchers that don't get a ton of strikeouts, but Fried is good enough at getting strikeouts, and he is just a very good real-life pitcher. I don't mind it on this slate. you also just don't have a ton of really good strikeout pitchers here either. I just mentioned Pepio having the second highest K percentage on the slate at 26.5%. Logan Gilbert at 25% is third. Then you get down to like Yariel Rodriguez, Nestor Cortez, 23 and 24%. So while there are some pretty good pitchers overall in this slate, it's not the best strikeout pitchers. And so it's not a slate where you're sacrificing a lot as far as Ks go by going to Fried like you are on a lot of the slates that he's been on this year. So I think that's another reason that he is showing up for me. It is, of course, a difficult matchup going up against the Phillies, but they have a pretty modest implied run total here. And again, Fried is just a very, very good pitcher overall. So willing to get to him at that price tag. Jack Flaherty is showing up right around the field, a little bit below the field for me. Very good strikeout matchup for him against the Mariners. This is a team that is probably going to strike out less over the rest of the season than they did year to date because of moves they made at the trade deadline. There's no more Ty France. You have Randy Arozarena, but it's still a team that's going to strike out a lot. They are getting a park upgrade here in LA. They are a team that I do know I'm getting to offensively as well, but this is just a spot where it makes a lot of sense to me on an 8-game slate in your large field top heavy tournaments to have a high percentage of your lineups on one side or the other, whether that's Flaherty or the Mariners bats. And obviously I'll have more to say about the Mariners bats later, but you have a team that has a lot of power, getting a park upgrade in LA, facing a pitcher in Flaherty that has been dominant this year, striking out 32% of hitters, but has allowed 1.4 home runs per 9 innings. And prior to his reemergence this season, had been a pretty mediocre pitcher in previous years. So that's not to say that he didn't make actual improvements and that, he's been lucky this year or anything like that. But it is to say there's a pretty decent chance that Jack Flaherty over the next month and a half is good, but not as good as he was over the first part of the season, just based on how sample sizes work and all of that. So it's a really interesting spot where Flaherty's obviously one of the best pitchers on the slate, highest strikeout percentage by a wide margin, good strikeout matchup, but he is also getting a lot of ownership, facing a team that has a lot of power. It's the type of spot where, especially on these medium-sized slates, I do like getting to both sides, and I am getting to Flaherty pretty close to the field, a little bit below it. So those are the three pitchers that I'm very heavily getting to. I like them all. The field is getting to all of them quite a bit. It is taking exposure away from pretty much everybody else. You can see here that other than those three, I have 11% Mitch Spence, which is pretty close to the field's 13%. And other than that, I'm not getting double-digit exposure to any other pitcher. That's not to say these pitchers are all bad. It's just that for me, prioritizing Pepio at 25% or 26% ownership, prioritizing Fried at 20% ownership is more important, and it's just giving me lineups that grade out better for me than getting to as much of the field, than getting to guys like Tyon or Nola or Cortez or Gibson as much as the field is. These are all guys that are getting like 11 to 20% ownership, and they're perfectly fine plays, but they don't look as good to me as Pepio or Fried do at their ownership. And so that leads to me just prioritizing Pepio and Fried. If I had run these lineups differently, going for a more balanced set, I'd still probably be getting a good amount of Pepio and Fried, but there is a good chance that this like 76% Pepio maybe would be like 50%. And I'd have another 25% of my lineups that I could allocate down to the second tier of pitchers with Tyon, Nola, Cortez that are all perfectly fine, just not guys that look quite as good. But because of the approach that I am taking here, I am prioritizing the plays that look the actual best to me at a little bit higher rate than I would if I were playing more balanced. So again, that's a trade-off that you're making, where if Pepio sucks today, I have fewer lineups that can bail me out. But if Pepio is really good and is one of the best pitching plays, like I think he is, I have more lineups that can actually capitalize on that. So that's why you're kind of seeing these guys fall off. Nola, good matchup against Atlanta, just a little bit more expensive than Pepio and Fried. Gilbert, I'm in line with the field. Tyon, good matchup against Detroit, but this is a young team that does have some talent. Tyon, though, just not a particularly good pitcher, and he's 8,400. He's getting similar ownership, less, but similar ownership to Fried. When you talk pitching talent, Tyon is not remotely close to Fried. Fried obviously has the more difficult matchup against Philadelphia, and that's why ownership looks how it does. But, I have Fried projected for 17 DraftKings points and change. Tyon at about 15. So they are similar, but Fried does look better to me. Same price tag, similar ownership. I'm just getting to more Fried here. Nestor Cortez, brutal strikeout matchup against Cleveland. $8,900 price tag is not particularly appealing. I'm actually a little surprised he's getting as much ownership as he is. Kyle Gibson, tough matchup overall, rather, against Milwaukee. Not a great strikeout pitcher. Milwaukee is an above average offense. So these pitchers that the field is getting to and I'm not, again, it's not that I think that like your lineup is bad if you have them or that they are bad plays, but I do think that the ownership to them is a little bit high relative to the pitchers that I'm actually getting to, compared to like their chances of success and how often I think they're going to succeed, all of that. So that's why I'm more concentrated on these three and then just not really getting to much else. That does increase volatility, like I said, but it does also open the door for, me to be in really good positions if Pepio does well, if Fried does well. John Musto said any Flaherty and Gilbert together. I would assume not much since I only have 9 out of 150 lineups with Gilbert, but that's not something that I care about too much. I assume you're asking since they're facing each other. There is obviously the negative being that only one of them can get a win. And on a slate that does have a pretty good amount of solid pitching options, that does matter. It's not like I'm Xing it out and making it so I don't get them together at all. But that is a slight negative for them. If you had a lineup where, you're just as a tiebreaker, like you're trying to choose between two pitchers that you feel pretty similar about, that you're going to play Flaherty, and then you're trying to decide between like Gilbert and Nola, for example. I would rather have Nola in that lineup just because it's 4 additional points I can get. So the answer is no in the lineups that I have right now. I don't have any Flaherty and Gilbert together. I don't set any sort of hard rule for that. But all things equal, I would rather have another pitcher that looks similar than those two together, but it's not the end of the world if they slip into a lineup here and there. So pitching exposure, very concentrated for me. Now moving over to stacks. Tampa, this is all stack types here. Tampa Bay, Seattle, Detroit, Cincinnati at the top. Not the best offenses. You can see the implied run totals here, not particularly high, but like I said at the top of the show, most teams on this slate do have relatively low implied run totals as well. So that's not as big of a deal. Some of these offenses, at least a couple of them, do pretty strongly negatively correlate with popular pitching, which is really, really nice, especially, again, in your largest field, top-heavy tournaments. Tampa Bay at the top, going up against Mitch Spence, who is not a great pitcher. He's not horrible, but he is getting 10 to 15% ownership because he's cheap. He looks like a pretty good value option. I was around 11% on him, but in lineups where you don't have him, perfectly fine getting to Tampa Bay. They're affordably priced. They're not the best offense, but it's an okay matchup against Spence. Like I said, they are affordable. They do have Junior Caminero, who was called up a week or so ago. He's one of the top prospects in baseball, so you have that. I don't have enough data on Mitch Spence to really have an opinion on his ability to prevent stolen bases. Ideally, you do get Tampa Bay going against guys that do allow stolen bases. So far this year, he has allowed 10, so in 108 innings pitched. So likely that he's not very good at holding runners, but again, just not a big enough sample that I have any definite conclusions on him. But I do like it better than I like the stolen base aspect better than the matchup with Estes yesterday. Spence is the better pitcher of the two, I think, even though Estes obviously dominated them yesterday. But he had allowed 0 stolen bases in 87 innings. Spence is at 10, so better stolen base spot most likely for Tampa Bay here than they had yesterday, at least. They, like I said, they're affordable. The park's not great, but Brandon Lau, $4,900. Everybody else in their projected lineup is $3,900 or less. So you can get really, really good teams around them, good pitching, good one-offs, good mini stacks, all of that. So it's not all just about, I think Tampa Bay is really likely to score 10 runs or something. But it's if they score 6-7 runs, they do open the door for you to have the best power hitters on the slate, the best strikeout pitchers on the slate alongside them. Seattle, I mentioned it a little bit when talking about Flaherty, but if 40 to 50% of the field is going to roster Jack Flaherty, it makes sense to be getting to Seattle in a major park upgrade for them. Keep in mind, I've said it, I think, every game of this series, But this is a team that, because they play more than half their games in pitcher-friendly parks, half their games are in Seattle, which is one of the most pitcher-friendly parks in baseball. And then let's say roughly 25% or 50% of their remaining 50% games, so 25% additional, are in pitcher-friendly parks. Like 75% of their games are in pitcher-friendly parks overall. They're naturally just going to be underpriced when they do go to a very hitter-friendly park like you have in LA. So the matchup with Flaherty is not good, but he's really popular. As a result, the Mariners won't be that popular. And he does give up power, even this year, like I said, where he's been a dominant pitcher overall. He's still allowed 1.4 home runs per 9 innings. He also spent most of the season pitching his home games in a pitcher-friendly park. Now he is in LA. The overall power numbers are not terrible. 161 expected ISO to righties, 136 to lefties. Pretty good overall. But there is certainly power upside here for Seattle. And it's a situation where they're not going to come through all that often. But when they do, you're going to be in a position to make a lot of money. And they don't have to come through all that often for it to be a profitable approach, given the ownership that Flaherty has. And also the percentage, the way that their runs are likely to be distributed. They're not going to score a lot of runs against Flaherty all that often. But when they do score a lot of runs, because of the way their offense is constructed and the park they're playing in, it is pretty likely that home runs play a big role, as opposed to even, Tampa Bay, a team that I'm getting to because of the value. Even, Tampa Bay is an example of the opposite of this. Even if Tampa Bay scores 7 or 8 runs tonight, there's a pretty good chance that it's on singles, doubles, stolen bases, not a ton of home runs in Oakland for a team that doesn't have a lot of power. So, I'm getting to them more so because of the value component. But with Seattle, if they do put up a big score, it's pretty likely that it's via a lot of home runs. This is a team that strikes out a lot, doesn't, they're not putting the ball in play, getting a bunch of singles and doubles all that often. They're looking to do damage when they're at the plate. And if they do come through against Flaherty in this park that is conducive to hitting home runs, it's just likely that you have a lot of home runs when they do well, which is nice. Detroit, again, not a great offense, but you had like 15% ownership or so coming into Jameson Taillon. This is a completely mediocre pitcher getting some ownership. 171 expected ISO allowed to lefties this year, 148 to righties. So you do prefer left-handed bats here for the Tigers. I did not have a Tigers lineup when I ran this. The lineup has come out since then. You have Parker Meadows leading off at 3,200, Riley Green, Kerry Carpenter's back in the lineup, Colt Keith is in there batting cleanup. So you have 4 lefties at the top of this order that all have at least some semblance of power. There's some stolen base upside as well. Then you get Spencer Torkelson, who's back from the minors, a basically min salary Jace Young from the left side hitting 6th. So you have 5 lefties in the top 6 rather, against Taillon. So that looks good. They all have some power / stolen base upside against him. So that looks good as well. The Cubs bullpen also does only have one left-handed pitcher. That is Drew Smyly. He pitched yesterday. He was off Monday and Sunday, so probably available today. But only one lefty makes it just a little bit more difficult for them to match up. Emwald said, I notice your pool exposure is just your lineup exposure. I'm curious where you're at on these stacks relative to the field. My pool exposure equals my lineup exposure because I only put 150 lineups into SaberSim. So basically, long story short, I do a bunch of stuff. Like I use SaberSim to simulate my lineups, to do all of that. But I also do stuff in Excel outside of SaberSim. The reason that what he's talking about here, pool exposure equals my exposure, is just that in this particular build, like the one that I'm showing on the screen, I took 150 lineups off of an Excel spreadsheet and just uploaded them into SaberSim. So it's just telling you that the pool is the total number of lineups that are in this build, which is only 150. And the exposure is the 150 that I selected. But in this case, it's just the same 150. Where you can see where I'm at relative to field, it's going to be compared to the ownership, which you can't see, unfortunately, on this screen. But yeah, it's the same thing why the pool equals lineup here. There's just not a column for field ownership, but you'll be able to see that when you go player by player. But that's just that's why it looks like that. It's just how the setup on SaberSim looks. So talked about Detroit, Cincinnati going up against Toronto. I've been getting to them in the series. It hasn't really worked out, but Yariel Rodriguez, good strikeout stuff, but still not a consistent, proven major league pitcher. 1.1 home runs per nine this year. He's walked about 12% of hitters, 4.35 xFIP. The Reds do have stolen base upside. They have power upside. Righties have actually done more damage against Rodriguez this year than lefties. He does have a splitter that could be the reason for that. That is a pitch that can lead to reverse splits. It is also a pretty small sample size, but a 200 actual ISO, 194 expected ISO for righties against Rodriguez, lefties sub 100 expected ISO. So I'll be curious to see what hitters I'm actually getting to. Then there's a little bit of a drop off, getting to the Yankees, getting to Kansas City. So these are two teams that I assume are relatively popular just based on their implied run totals. I am getting there, just not quite as much as these other negatively correlated teams or value teams. Cleveland, Atlanta showing up a little bit below that. If we look at five mans, I am a little bit flatter too, but still getting to Cincy, Tampa Bay, Detroit, and Seattle the most. Then there's a drop off where I'm just kind of mixing in some Atlanta, some KC, Angels, Milwaukee, Toronto, St. Louis. So you can see that it's not like across 150 lineups I'm jamming like one or two teams, but I am pretty concentrated on these top four. And then there's a drop off to where I'm getting less of pretty much everybody else. So now we can go player by, position by position, and you'll be able to get a better feel here for where I am taking stands on the field since you couldn't see ownership on the previous screen. Obviously, in a lot of cases, the players I'm getting to heavily are just going to be the same players, or they're going to be in the stacks that I was just talking about. But starting here with Cal Raleigh, projected for 4% ownership, I'm getting to 27%. Again, if I were taking a more balanced approach like I did on shows previously this week, and like I generally tend to do in tournaments, just to kind of try and limit the swings a little bit, I would probably have, 10% Raleigh, 12% Raleigh, something like that, where I'd still be over the field, but not as aggressively. But I also don't mind just taking this kind of stand on somebody like Cal Raleigh, who is one of the best power hitting catchers in baseball. He is in a hitter-friendly park now. The matchup sucks, but there's still, it's just an example where you can take advantage of variance in baseball. There is so much of it. The matchup against Flaherty sucks, but Flaherty is just not going to have his best stuff a decent percentage of the time because that's how it is. And then even when he does have good stuff, you're just going to have starts where he gives up a home run to Cal Raleigh, or he gets unlucky and ends up leaving the game kind of early for reasons. So you can just, embrace volatility here, get one of the best power hitting catchers in baseball at virtually no ownership. And then, oh, by the way, when Cal Raleigh does hit a home run off Jack Flaherty, 40 to 50% of the field is losing points there also. So really, really just strong play here in Raleigh. Tyler Stevenson going up against Rodriguez. So a right-handed bat that does have some power. We know that right-handed power plays up in Toronto as well. So I really like that play. He is getting ownership. I'm a little over the field, but nothing too crazy. Pretty much in line with the field with Salvador Perez, but that actually probably means that I'm over the field overall because he's projected for 12 to 13% ownership. I have him in 12% of my lineups at catcher, but you can also play him at first base. So overall, probably actually a little bit above the field on him, which is Salvador Perez. So obviously I'm fine with that. Pretty much even on David Fry, getting above the field on Jake Rogers, but again, not taking any sort of crazy stand. He's in 7% of my lineups. He's projected for 2% ownership. He is, or was projected to bat ninth. He is batting ninth. So whereas Cal Raleigh is somebody that like I'm actually happy to be taking a big stand on, I wouldn't be as excited if I saw that I had like 25% Jake Rogers and I was taking some crazy stand on a 9-hitter for the Tigers. Cal Raleigh is the kind of guy that I'd be much more willing to take that stand on. So I am happy with how that worked out. I am over the field on Rogers, but he's not making or breaking my night. I wouldn't really want him to. Austin Wells, pretty much even with the field. So, kind of spread out on the rest of the catchers here, but taking a stand on Raleigh and then pretty much matching the field on Stevenson and Perez at catcher. The field is projected to get to Logan O'Hoppe around 10%. I only have about 4% there. He's never somebody that I mind getting to. He gives you stolen base upside. He has some power. Michael Lorenzen also has reverse splits, which is good for O'Hoppe. 220 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters. So I don't think O'Hoppe is a bad play. I don't think that's the reason that I'm not getting as much as the field. I think it just has more to do with, in part, how much Cal Raleigh I'm getting to. It's just cutting into Ohapi a little bit. It's making it so, if I'm going to get to 25% Raleigh and then 10 to 15% of Perez and Stevenson, that's nearly half of my catcher exposures. And then I'm going to kind of just be spread out, probably using a lot of catchers in stacks and that kind of stuff. So it's more so just a probably lack of getting to the Angels overall, pulling down Ohapi a little bit as opposed to anything about Ohapi. If you're building lineups and Ohapi fits, he's a good play here. Does have plenty of upside against Lorenzen. One slight negative is that Lorenzen is extremely good at controlling the running game. Obviously, you don't think about it with Ohapi, or generally with catchers, but Ohapi actually can run a little bit. Not to say that the bulk of his fantasy production is from stolen bases. He only has 2 this year, but he is somebody that, if it were an advantageous matchup, could run a little bit. He does give you at least a little bit of that upside, whereas a lot of catchers, it doesn't exist. But anyway, that's not like it's a big downgrade for him. He doesn't run frequently. He just can a little bit. Austin Wells, pretty much in line with the field. Contreras, same thing. So I'm pretty much getting to the most popular catchers with the exception of Ohapi. Thoughts on Cleveland stacks, Yankees bullpen, considering Yankees bullpen was used heavily last night. Yeah, it does make Cleveland look, marginally better. Just anytime you're going up against a weakened bullpen, the Yankees used every single reliever that they have available. Now, it's not as big of an issue because the Yankees were off on Monday. So I would assume that most of these guys are available. Jake Cousins threw 35 pitches yesterday. Michael Tonkin threw 35. Tim Hill threw 24. There's a pretty decent chance, I would think, that Cousins and Tonkin are not available. Hill, probably pretty borderline. I would assume that the rest of them are. So it's not as advantageous as if they had all pitched on, a bunch of them had pitched on Monday too, and you were in a situation where these guys were all overused. Them being off Monday does kind of limit that. For Cleveland, on the other side, obviously a very, very good bullpen there. They used all but 2 of their relievers. Eli Morgan didn't pitch. Pedro Avila didn't pitch. But they also were off on Monday. Nobody in their bullpen threw more than 23 pitches. I assume they're probably all available. If maybe 1 or 2 of them are not. But it's not as big a deal as that extra inning game yesterday is not as big a deal. It wasn't as taxing on the bullpens as it would have been if either of those teams or both of those teams had played on Monday. So it is slightly positive for those stacks, just as far as there's a little bit of an increased chance that, a relief pitcher is less effective on his second day back-to-back, but it's not a situation where I expect either bullpen to be significantly limited as far as the number of relievers that they can bring in, where if somebody is ineffective, they just have to leave him out there. I don't think it's that kind of situation. Moving over to first base, not getting any Salvador Perez at first base, so I am pretty much just matching the field on his overall ownership. Ty France showing up a lot for me, 8% projected ownership, showing up 21% of the time. Right-handed bat that has some power in Rogers Center against Rodriguez. I like it. He is cheap. He's not a great hitter, but does have some power upside in this park and matchup, so it makes sense to me. You're also saving some salary. Yandy Diaz, not surprising given that I'm getting to those Tampa Bay stacks. Projected to be leading off, only 3,700. Not a great park for hitting home runs. Actively bad park for hitting home runs. It is good for hitting doubles. But it's just a pretty favorable salary at 3,700. And like I was saying when I talked about Tampa Bay before, it's mostly just that you can stack those guys together and then be getting to whatever you want elsewhere. You can pay up for Flaherty if that's what you want to do. You can get to, Shohei Ohtani or whatever pay up bats you want with these cheap Tampa Bay guys. And so that's why Diaz is showing up. That's why Brandon Lau is showing up. I assume I have a pretty big stand on Lau. He's showing up 15% for me at first base. He's only projected for 7% total ownership. So just at first base, I'm 2x the field, and I would be surprised if I just don't have him at second base. So probably a pretty sizable stand on him. Vinny Pasquantino matching the field. Like I mentioned, Lorenzen is reverse split, but Pasquantino is a good hitter, and it's a good park for offense. So clearly getting to him is going to be fine. Torkelson, kind of similar to Jake Rogers, where I have a nice stand on the field. Like I'm 3x the field on Torkelson, but he's not making or breaking my night. He does have power upside. Maybe he put things together at AAA, and you're going to see the good version of Torkelson that we saw at times last year. Price tag is reasonable, does negatively correlate with Tyon. But like I was saying, you do prefer the left-handed bats in this spot against Tyon and the Cubs bullpen that only has one left-handed pitcher in Drew Smyly. Shohei Ohtani, 5% of my lineups at first base. I assume I have more in the outfield. It is a tough matchup for him against Logan Gilbert, but he is Shohei Ohtani, so I don't really care that much. 149 expected ISO to lefties for Gilbert this year. Again, you're not rostering Ohtani because Gilbert isn't good. You're just rostering him because he's insanely good. Rhys Hoskins, Olsen showing up a little bit. Field is getting to mostly guys that I'm getting to. Nico Cavadas is showing up, projected to be in about 9% of the Field's lineup. I don't have him. He's 2K. He's perfectly fine as a value play, but he's somebody where I think what's likely to happen, and probably part of the reason I'm not getting to him, is like he's the kind of guy that you would go to if either you're stacking the Angels, which I'm not doing much of, or if you're going to a more expensive stack, like maybe you're stacking the Yankees and including Judge and Soto, mixing in Cavadas would offset some of that salary. But the problem, and this is one of the things that is nice about using Sims as opposed to just straight optimizers. One of the problems is that you're going to run into a situation where a lot of the lineups that have him are similarly constructed. They're using similar stacks. And so there's a decent chance that not only is he 8% owned, which isn't super popular or anything, but that a high percentage of the lineups that have him also have, like Judge plus Soto or Ohtani plus Judge or something like that. You get the point where he is disproportionately with these really expensive power hitters or Jack Flaherty or something like that. And so it's a little bit deceiving where it's like, oh, well, he's 2K and he's relatively low owned at 8%. That is true. But the lineups that you would end up playing him in are the same sorts of lineups that like the entire 8% of the field is playing him in. So it kind of is a little bit misleading just looking at that ownership number. That's probably another reason he's not showing up for me, is that I was getting to cheaper stacks. I'm getting to Seattle. I'm getting to Tampa Bay. I'm getting to Detroit. And once I'm going to those stacks, it's going to allow me to get to better one-offs and not punt with him. So it's probably a combination of a couple things why I don't really have much of him. Getting to Yandy, not getting to much Vlad. It's Vlad. If you get to him, great. I don't have any sort of like anti-Vlad Guerrero takes here. He's really, really good. Nick Martinez isn't a bad pitcher. 106 expected ISO allowed to righties this year. A lot of that time has been out of the bullpen. So I would expect him to be worse as a starter than his numbers overall this season, but he's not a bad pitcher. Vlad Guerrero is an extremely good hitter. I just don't have a lot, but again, it's not like an anti-Vlad take there. Spencer Steer, I'll be interested to see how much outfield exposure I have because I do know I'm getting to the Reds. I do like the spot against Rodriguez, given that Steer does have some right-handed power. He is really expensive, which isn't ideal, but maybe just getting him a little bit more in the outfield. If I'm going to be stacking the Reds, I would like to be getting to a good amount of Steer, just because he does give you plenty of upside. I'm trying to get Rodriguez's stolen base numbers also. Not a big sample size for him, so it's not in my spreadsheet in front of me, but so far this season, he's allowed 5 stolen bases in 56 innings. Could be not good at holding runners, could just be small sample size, don't really know. Spencer Steer does have like 20 stolen bases this year, though, so I do like at least that I didn't just pull up Rodriguez's stolen base numbers and it's like 0. There is at least some chance that Steer is going to be running here. At second base, we have Brandon Lau in 11%. So combined, I have like 25% Brandon Lau, quite a bit over the field. Christopher Morel, 4,100, 19% of my lineups, 8% of the field. So again, Tampa Bay guy, likely to be hitting at the top or in the middle of the order. Don't have that lineup yet, but top or middle of the order most likely. And if I'm stacking Tampa Bay, obviously I'd be wanting to get to him. Gleyber Torres getting 15% ownership. I'm pretty much with the field there. He is leading off, which is a nice bump. He'd been hitting towards the bottom of the order more often than not lately. So that's nice. He's very fairly priced at 3,800. Joey Cantillo getting the start for Cleveland. No real sample size, but he is a lefty. He has a lot of 200 expected ISO so far this season. The downside, anytime you're facing Cleveland, is that the bullpen is very good. So even if the Yankees do get to Cantillo early, it's pretty likely to just be over at that point once he leaves the game. But it is a good matchup, good price play on Gleyber Torres. I don't mind just being right around the field on that. Jonathan India, pretty much in line with the field. Right-handed bat in Rogers Center against Rodriguez. Again, I like that. Brandon Lau, we talked about Jorge Polanco. This is another, pretty good example where when you're thinking about player exposures too, a lot is going to have to do with the position that you're at. So we know that I'm getting to a lot of Seattle. We saw that I'm getting a ton of Cal Raleigh. I think he was actually my highest owned batter. And so there was a chance that I was going to just click through all of these positions and it's going to just be me jamming Seattle guys. But here at second base, you have a deeper position in general than catcher. So the opportunity cost is higher. But also you have, when you think about the other teams that I'm stacking, the Tigers don't have a catcher that I really care about getting to in Jake Rogers. The Rays have shitty catching options. I don't care about getting to any of them. Cincinnati has Tyler Stevenson, who I am getting to. But that's going to push up Cal Raleigh. It's going to allow me to get to more Cal Raleigh because he is such a high upside catcher compared to most other catchers. Whereas at second base, if I'm stacking Tampa, I want Morel. I want Lau. I want Jonathan India if I'm stacking the Reds. Gleyber Torres is just a good value play that I don't want to just be like cutting out of my lineups for no real reason. So that just makes it so I'm over the field on Polanco. I'm like 4x the field, but I'm not jamming him in the lineups at the same rate as Raleigh. So that's kind of just like a nuanced thing to keep in mind too when you are looking at your own player exposures or maybe thinking about how you want to attack a slate. If you're somebody that, sort of manually adjusts exposures you're getting to, make sure that you are keeping in mind what you're giving up at different positions and not just saying like, oh, I want Seattle, so I'm going to play 25% of everybody on Seattle. You should be factoring in opportunity cost at positions. And it is relatively high at second base for a variety of reasons today. Pretty much around the field on Merrifield going up against Aaron Nola. Nice lineup spot for him, hitting second, 3,300, good price tag. Obviously a tough matchup though. Michael Massey, I am about half the field. Probably just an ownership thing. He's projected for more ownership than everybody except for Torres and Drury. Again, I'm not really getting to much of the Angels here. They just aren't a very good offense, and they're getting a lot of ownership. They're getting the ownership because they are cheap. They're in a good hitter's park. They're facing a very mediocre pitcher in Michael Lorenzen. But, Brandon Drury is just not the type of hitter that I'm scared to not have. If the Angels score a bunch of runs tonight and the 10 to 15% of the field that has them wins, then fine. I'll take some guys that actually hit for power. So I'm not really getting to Drury. I am about half the field on Massey. I am not getting to a bunch of Adam Frazier. I've used Frazier in this example a lot before where, even when he has good games for him, like, yeah, sometimes he'll hit a home run, steal a base. And even then you can find other guys that do that, obviously. But, then it's like, damn, I wish I had Adam Frazier. Normally a good Adam Frazier game is still like 2 singles, a couple runs scored, and like 12 fantasy points. So he's just not the power hitting, base stealing guy that you're like afraid not to have when they're popular. So I'm not really getting there. I am getting to India. I'm getting around the field on Leo Jimenez. He got a nice lineup bump to 6. But yeah, you can see I'm kind of just not getting to, I'm getting to Torres, but then I'm not getting to the next 3 highest owned guys at second base. But I do like the second baseman I'm getting to. So I'm perfectly fine with that. It's not like I was looking at this and just saying, I hate all these second base options. John Warner said Cantillo has reverse splits. I assume that's based on his minor league numbers. I hadn't looked, but either way, like Torres at that price, I'm not going to get that bogged down in it. It does, looking at his pitch mix, I'm not surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if he does. He's throwing a changeup 26% of the time to right-handed hitters. That is a pitch that leads to reverse splits. Very small major league sample size, obviously. But moving to third base, Jace Young, I like this one. 7% ownership. He's batting 6th, so he's actually a little bit higher in the order than he was projected to be. This is a solid hitting prospect. He's got a pretty decent matchup against Tyon. Hits left-handed, so he has the platoon advantage. Projects to be a slightly below average major league hitter at this point in his career, but did hit 14 home runs at AAA this year. 118 WRC plus, 198 ISO. Does have some power upside, and he's basically minimum salary. He's not that popular. If you're stacking Detroit, it makes a lot of sense. If you're mini stacking Detroit, it makes some sense. Junior Caminero, again, a top prospect. We don't have the Tampa Bay lineup yet, but I assume he's going to be in it. Gives you plenty of hitting upside. He's still pretty cheap. You can play him only at third base now. He did lose shortstop eligibility, which sucks. Limits your flexibility now in stacking Tampa a little bit more than it was before. But He projects to be an average to above average hitter at the major league level already, depending on which projection system you're looking at. Zips projects a 100 WRC plus rest of season. Steamers at 111. The Bat's at 104. And keep in mind, the Bat is generally pretty pessimistic on prospects in general. So anytime I see like a 104 WRC plus projection for the Bat, when you're talking about a guy that has been in the major leagues for a week, I assume that he is going to be really, really good, or at least, is likely to be really good. So obviously, like getting to him at 3,100, I'm a little under 2x the field, but over the field. Noelvi Marte, 3K. He is batting 8th, so the lineup spot sucks, but 3K is a pretty good price tag. Again, Rodriguez has allowed more power to righties than lefties this year. Marte certainly capable of doing some damage in this park as well. So probably not somebody I would love as a one-off all that often, but in mini stacks or full stacks, I think looks pretty good. Gives you a little bit of stolen base upside as well, as 4 stolen bases so far this season. Not somebody that steals a ton, but he runs often enough that it's, at least worth mentioning that it's there, at 3K. Espinal, 2,700. Again, not an exciting guy to get to. I'm not taking a huge stand on him. He's only in 9% of my lineups, but if you're stacking Cincinnati, you may as well be getting to at least a little bit of him as well. Then just kind of mixing in these other guys. Already mentioned Brandon Drury. I wasn't getting to at second base. Not getting to much at third base either. Anthony Rendon, not really getting to. Same thing. I mean, I understand that this team projects well for their salaries. Michael Lorenzen, not a great pitcher, has reverse splits, gives up power to righties. But overall, this team still sucks at hitting. And if the Angels were like, 3, 4, 5% owned today, I would probably be saying, yeah, they suck at hitting, but I'll play them in this park against this pitcher. It's purely an ownership thing, I think, where, I can just not play the 10 to 15% owned guys that suck at hitting and hope that they suck at hitting today. So that's the approach that I'm likely to take. Addison Barger, Field's getting to him. I'm not getting to him at third, maybe getting to him a little bit in the outfield. Again, this is just a cheap value play that people are going to use to get the Flaherty, to get to, the outfield bats that they want, which is perfectly fine. I'm just not quite there. I have some other ones that I'm getting to instead. I'm not getting to Peraza at third base, maybe at shortstop, not sure. Around the field on Ramirez. So once again, the theme so far kind of just that I'm not playing the Angels. Hopefully they have a worse game against Lorenzen than they did against Reagans, because that's how baseball works. I was over the field on them yesterday against Reagans. I'm not playing them against Lorenzen. You kind of just get used to that kind of stuff when you're playing a lot of large field baseball tournaments. It's just kind of how it ends up working out. Ellie De La Cruz, happy to be seeing this. 19% exposure for me. Fields at 13. He's obviously expensive, but he's a good standalone play. He's good in mini stacks. And if you're playing Cincinnati, then obviously he just looks even better, because if those Cincinnati teams are coming through, you assume that De La Cruz is probably having a good game as well. Jake DeWitt said no Langoliers for Oakland. Yeah, that's a benefit for Pepio for sure. Makes him look better. Not that I really even needed him to. Trey Sweeney showing up a lot. So this is kind of like, he's batting 8th. He's not somebody that I love getting to, but we've seen the field punting with guys like Adam Frazier and, Brandon Drury and to whatever other bad hitters I've mentioned, Addison Barger. I'm just going to get some Sweeney, I guess, at shortstop, where I'm not paying up for De La Cruz or Witt. Getting to some of Sweeney, perfectly fine. Does have the decent matchup. He is another left-handed bat against Tyon. One other nice thing is that he does give you stolen base upside. I've talked about this a lot with Baldwin on the White Sox. If I'm going to punt with 2K, minimum salary hitters, ideally, normally they're not going to be 2K if they're good hitters. Sweeney doesn't project to be a good hitter. Most projection systems are between like 78 and 83 WRC plus on Fangraphs. He had an 87 WRC plus at AAA for the Dodgers this year. This guy does not look like a hitter at all, but he can steal bases, which means if he just somehow finds a way to get on, he hits a ground ball to second base with a runner on first and beats the throw to first on the double play, you get 5 points, or you at least have the potential to get 5 points from him. So stolen base upside, at least, even if he's not a great hitter. Tyon is pretty average at controlling the running game. This also just has to do with the stacks I'm getting to. If I wasn't playing a bunch of Detroit stacks, I probably also wouldn't be playing a lot of Sweeney. Jake DeWitt said definitely opportunity cost at short. Yeah, 100%. But you can see, I'm getting to De La Cruz. I'm getting to Witt. Those are the guys that, I really want to be getting to. he's not costing me them. He's costing me Zach Neto, Leo Jimenez, as Oswald Peraza, Ernie Clement, Anthony Volpe. Not even really costing me Volpe. I'm pretty close to the field. So, like, I'm not getting Mookie, at least at shortstop. Might be getting in the outfield. I'm not getting Turner. But the shortstops, the pay-up shortstops that I would really want, De La Cruz against Rodriguez and Witt in KC, I am getting those guys around, if not higher than the field. So it's not costing me those guys. It's costing me more. It's costing me like the mid-range guys that project pretty well, and aren't bad plays like Zach Neto or Anthony Volpe, but that aren't superstars either, mostly. So that was something I had noticed and I thought was interesting too. Like if you look at the shortstops I'm getting to, 6,100 De La Cruz, 6,600 Witt, 2,100 Sweeney, 3 of the top 4. And then Caballero, of course, in those Tampa Bay stacks, hopefully hitting higher in the order than 9th, but even projected to hit 9th, he is showing up for me. Then it's just kind of just mixing and matching these other guys in. And then finally wrapping things up with the outfield, where hopefully I am paying up for some guys based on the stacks that I'm getting to. Josh Lowe, Tampa Bay stacks, pretty self-explanatory. Same goes for Parker Meadows. Gives you some stolen base upside as well, and he is cheap, leading off for Detroit. Julio Rodriguez. If I'm going to be stacking the Mariners, I want to be getting to Rodriguez. Obviously, his power numbers this year have been down, but prior to his injury, he was looking like one of the more unlucky hitters against right-handed, or against, just in general this year also. So there is, that component. This season against right-handed pitching, a sub 100 actual ISO, 162 expected ISO. So not doing as much expected damage as you would like, but still significantly higher than his actual. If you go back to last year, 186 expected ISO against righties. And again, you do get a big park upgrade here, hitting in Dodger Stadium. Jack Flaherty is very, very good at controlling the running game. So that is a downside for Rodriguez and for the Mariners in general. But like I said at the top of the show, getting to the Mariners here isn't about exploiting Flaherty. It's not that Flaherty looks bad or the field is missing anything. It's about purely exploiting the field and saying baseball is random as shit. And when the Mariners, for whatever reason, have a big game against Flaherty, I have a really, really clear path to winning a lot of money, is the case for getting to Seattle. It's not Flaherty being bad at anything. So Rodriguez, if you're going that Seattle route, obviously you'd want to be getting to Julio Rodriguez. Then we get back to other guys from stacks that I'm playing a lot of. Matt Vierling, Riley Green. Vierling is not in the lineup, so he obviously goes away. Maybe turns into, I don't know if I had Kerry Carpenter in. I can check that, but so I did have Carpenter in, but I would assume like Vierling here just turns into more Carpenter. I would have liked it to have been more Carpenter anyway, but regardless, that probably just becomes like more Kerry Carpenter. I'm getting to a bunch of Riley Green at low ownership. I'm getting to a bunch of Arozarena at low ownership. Again, Arozarena, same thing as Julio Rodriguez. It's not that I think he's likely to do damage or have success against Jack Flaherty, but if the Mariners cause problems for 40 to 50% on Flaherty, I'm going to just bet on Riley, Arozarena, Rodriguez to be a big reason why, because obviously they are more likely than anybody else. Johnny DeLuca, value play if he's in the lineup for Tampa Bay. If he's not, that turns into like Carlson or Siri or something like that. Victor Robles, likely to be hitting at the top of the order for Seattle. So everybody here at the top in outfield exposure, with the exception of Lowe and to some extent Meadows, is low owned. But they just all are in my stacks. So they positively correlate with a lot of my lineups. TJ Friedel around the field on Springer. I'm a little surprised that I'm not getting to more Judge, Soto, Ohtani in the outfield. I was kind of hoping I would be because I knew I was playing cheap stacks, but it seems like that salary is kind of just being allocated more to like shortstop, getting to De La Cruz, getting to Witt. Looking at popular hitters, I'm around half the field on MJ Melendez. Again, I think it's just an ownership thing. MJ Melendez is fine, but Kansas City looks slightly better than most teams on tonight's slate, but it's not by like a massive margin. And the field is playing it like it is. And so I'm just not getting to as much Melendez. I'm getting to Aaron Judge, just not as much as the field. Not surprisingly, I'm less than half the field on Taylor Ward. Getting to about half the field on Soto, around the field on Stanton. So I'm fine really with the outfielders that I'm not getting to that are popular. The ones that I wish I were getting more of are Judge and Soto, because like obviously those are the guys that like I'm really scared to just not have a lot of. MJ Melendez does, he can hit for power. He can make you regret not playing him at 3,400, but he's still more of like he's a price play, and the field's playing a lot of him because he's cheap and his offense as a whole projects well. Whereas Judge and Soto, are the guys where it's just like, yeah, they can so easily just hit 2 home runs and you need to have them. But overall, I think I'm pretty fine with the teams I'm not getting to. I at least am happy with the theory behind the teams I am getting to. I'd be lying if I said that I love that I'm playing the Tigers instead of the Yankees, or that I'm playing the Mariners against Jack Flaherty instead of the Royals. But I think that, if you're familiar with how DFS tournaments work, you understand the theory behind it. You understand, how that can pay off when, you have the Tigers against a 15% owned, very mediocre pitcher in Tyon. You have the Mariners in a huge park upgrade against a 40 or 50% owned Jack Flaherty. So, not likely to succeed. And that's, more often than not, you're going to lose money in any specific day's DraftKings, tournament. But that's the case whether you play the highest projected guys or not. So it's just, trying to put yourself in situations where when something goes right, you actually get paid off the most. So pretty happy with how this all looks for me, which makes me feel good because, like I said, I do generally use a more balanced approach. So it is nice to see that I can switch to a more exploitive approach and still have lineups that make a lot of sense. It makes me feel good about my process. Again, if you haven't already signed up, I've dug into my process, my tournament process, in videos, instructional videos at Endgame Syndicate. So is Uticow, so is Brick75. Nerdy Tanner has a bunch of videos out as well. So sign up using the link below. Get in before football season. Get yourself in as good a spot as you can be going into the best time of the year to make money. Other than that, if there are not any last-minute questions, Jorge said, what's your stand on Milwaukee versus Gibson? I didn't really have much of any of it. I don't think I mentioned any. I think I had like 5% Contreras. Other than that, I don't think I mentioned. Yeah, I have 3% Gibson, Fields at 12. So he was one of the pitchers that I'm just, the Field's getting to a bit, and I'm not. I didn't have much Milwaukee. It kind of just was a situation that I'm not really getting to much of it. And you'll see that a lot. Generally, why that's going to happen is that none of it, there's like 3 things that are going to drive up player exposures or stack exposures for me. And it depends in part on kind of what strategy I'm using, but being the best point per dollar projected players is going to push guys up. Being the best raw projected or highest ceiling, however you want to phrase that, most favorable range of outcomes is going to push guys up. Or being however you want to phrase this, the most underowned or the best like leverage against the field plays is going to push teams up. So if you look at like the teams I'm getting to today, Seattle, best leverage, best negative correlated play going up against Flaherty. Detroit, good combination of point per dollar projection and some negative correlation. Tampa Bay, same thing because Spence is getting some ownership. The Yankees and Kansas City, these are teams that just have the most favorable range of outcomes, the highest ceiling. When you talk about the Gibson versus Milwaukee matchup, Gibson's getting a little bit of ownership, but Milwaukee is more expensive than like Tampa Bay or Detroit, teams that are going against similarly owned pitchers. So they don't get pushed up quite as much as those teams do. Gibson is getting ownership and not really underpriced. So there's nothing like driving him up. It kind of just ends up being a spot where it's just like a dead zone to me, where that's not to say Milwaukee doesn't have upside or Gibson can't have a good game or whatever. It's just like they're efficiently priced. They're efficiently owned. There's nothing driving them up for me. So that's kind of why those dead zones end up popping up like that. Ken said, give us your crazy off the wall take for this slate. I really fucking hope that Seattle scores a lot of runs. That I don't know if it's a take. Like, I don't think it's going to happen, but that would be what I want to happen, and kind of, I guess, the easiest way to make money on this slate, I think. So I'll go with that one. But other than that, thanks again for checking out the show. Subscribe to Endgame Syndicate or Dub Club, whichever. Like I said, the Dub Club stuff is included at Endgame Syndicate with all the strategy stuff. The Dub Club link is if you just want the data, but not all the strategy stuff. Check out the Draft Caddy if you are doing best ball drafts. Otherwise, be back here same time tomorrow. Thanks again for checking out the video.